and sound. The vision and sound are on. The station goes on the air.
You are looking at the importance and history of live broadcasting events and how it brings people together. So we're starting off with the evolution of broadcasting has been one of the most important cultural hallmarks of the last century. In this project, I will attempt to identify and discuss some of the most significant points in that history. Looking at some key moments from the history of radio and television, I will seek to draw some conclusions about what has been momentous and why, and how it has shaped the society in which we now live. I will initially be starting with how radio came about and developed into the mass phenomenon it is today, before swiftly moving on to the big world of television broadcasting. Although they developed at a parallel rate, I'm focusing on one and then the other, including sporting and the royals, before looking at where the future of live broadcasting lies. I'm looking at this after working on live broadcast at festivals and music events. This is where ideally my career lies in the future. With the music element from radio and the broadcast from television, I think it's important to have a bit of knowledge on how it began and how the future is looking in this field. In 1897, Guglielmo Marconi was recognised as creating the first radio transmission. On June 15, 1920, after lots of tweaks, experiments and other projects, Marconi broadcast a recital by world-famous Australian opera star Dame Nellie Melba from Marconi's headquarters in Chelmsford. Now, although Marconi primarily focused on formal communications for those out at sea, rather than for entertainment purposes, this broadcast reached numerous countries. He later went on to broadcast at the first London station, Marconi House. Now, Marconi's radio licence was stripped from him after this for broadcasting entertainment. In the years following the First World War, many former military radio operators became amateur radio enthusiasts, tinkering with their homemade sets to pick up transmissions and transmitting their own talks or music. They used radio to share their discoveries, forming a community of fellow experimenters. Therefore, when broadcasting came to a halt, the General Post Office, otherwise known as the GPO, was met with some 3,000 of them with a signed petition calling for broadcasting to return. Now, over in America, at the dawn of the broadcasting era, the free market prevailed. The government set no rules. The 1912 Radio Act authorised the Federal Commerce and Labour Department to issue radio station licences to US citizens upon request, which it did, resulting in chaos. By 1922, 564 broadcasting stations were operating and their signals were often interfering with one another, which threatened to kill the budding industry in the cradle. Radio station owners asked the government to step in and fix the mess. So the UK government could see this wasn't working in America and were terrified of this happening in Britain. Therefore, anyone who wanted to broadcast had to have a government-issued licence. In 1922, all the competing interests were merged into the British Broadcasting Company. At the end of 1926, the BBC was nationalised and became the British Broadcasting Corporation. John Reith, Director General of the BBC, set out its mission to inform, educate and to entertain. On the 14th November 1922, 2LO was born. This was the BBC's first daily radio service, based in London and only reaching the surrounding areas. Now, by the end of 1923, Manchester, Birmingham and Wales also had launched their own BBC stations. The first programme at 6 p.m. was a news bulletin supplied by the local news agencies. This was followed also by a weather forecast prepared by the Met Office. As the BBC was not allowed to report its own news for the fear of broadcast media being a strong competitor against newspapers, the BBC did not gain the right to edit the news they received until 1934. And even then, it wouldn't be until the Second World War that they were allowed to broadcast before 6 p.m. It was assumed that after that time, everyone who was going to buy a newspaper for the day already would have, and so it was safe to broadcast the news without threatening the newspaper sales. Now, radio was a huge novelty at first, as many families couldn't afford to have radios in their homes individually. The GPO had issued only around 30,000 licenses for radio receivers by the time of the first BBC transmission. The amateur radio community continued to flourish, friends clustering around the inconsistent and unamplified crystal sets using headphones to listen. For example, Jemima Lewis from Kidwelly reminisces back. When we were children back in the 1930s, my father and a neighbour sent away for parts and they built their own radio. At first, we had headphones so only one could listen at a time, but then my father had a loudspeaker and fixed it up on the wall, and then we could all listen. And on a Sunday evening, neighbours would come along to our house and have a church service on the radio. Moving on and starting to look at the key radio broadcasts, 1927 was the year that the BBC brought the thrill of live sporting events straight into people's living rooms for the first time. The broadcast of the England v Wales Rugby International at Twickenham kicked things off.
Well, the first half has been about as exciting as anyone could wish for. Oh, I can't go that. They're off again. They're changing over.
For the score of 11-9 to England, since you asked, followed by the Grand National, which was the first racing commentary. The first cricket commentary was on the 25th of March, the 13th of August being the first broadcast of the BBC Promenade concert from the Queen's Hall in London. On April the 2nd, the English Cup final, which is now renamed the FA Cup, between Arsenal and Cardiff saw around 15,000 Cardiff City fans gather in Cardiff Cathays Park to listen to the first live broadcast from London. And they weren't disappointed. The historic 1-0 victory remains the only time the Cup has ever left England. This afternoon, Saturday, April 23rd, the broadcasting of sporting events will reach another landmark in its history. Is it too much to claim that broadcasting has become as important to followers of sport as it has long been to music, lovers and people who want to dance? That was from the Radio Times, April 1927, broadcasting the match of the year. After 1928 marked the first live performance on radio, where Jack Payne and his band, the Sicilians, broadcast in the Hotel Cecil in London. By the end of 1939, there were nearly 9 million licence holders, and many more listeners in Britain. Not to forget about, by this point, television was also on the rise in popularity. Radio was beginning to create a huge impact on existing media, such as newspapers, for instance, as although the public was still reading newspapers, an added benefit of radio broadcasts was the ability to not only audibly receive news, but to receive it in real time. Newspapers and print media could only be taken in after events took place, but radio broadcasts were able to cover live events. It was quite the breakthrough, being able to deliver news to the people of Britain all at the same time, when that same year of 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had to break the painful news that war had been declared on Germany. It was quite natural for him to do so through the pervasive medium of radio. This would reach the public of the UK an awful lot quicker than through newspaper.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This country is at war with Germany.
Now, while the BBC Home Service broadcasts to listeners on the home front, throughout the war, the Empire Service spread Britain's point of view around the world. Alongside all of this evolution of radio, television was also well underway, as they roughly developed on a parallel timeline. So this brings us into television's timeline. So starting off with, John Logie Baird experimented with the television image in 1924 in Hastings. His first transmission was the image of a Maltese cross over the distance of 10 feet, yet Baird's first public demonstration of television was in 1925 in Selfridge's shop in London. This breakthrough came in October 1925 when Baird achieved television pictures with light and shade, which were halftones, making them appear much clearer. His first television programme showed the heads of 2 ventriloquist dummies, which he operated in front of the camera apparatus out of the view of the audience. He demonstrated these to invited members of the Royal Institution in January 1926, and the pictures measured a teeny 3.5 by 2 inches, so naturally you were quite far from the television we know of yet, unless you're intending on broadcasting to a little family of mice. In 1934, its television interests were merged with those of EMI Limited in a company called the Marconi EMI Television Company Limited, in which it was responsible for all aspects of transmission. Although Baird's breakthrough took place in 1936, BBC eventually, in 1937, adopted the competing Marconi system exclusively, as it produced better picture and was easier to transport, making this not only beneficial in the studio, that gave more freedom for the potential broadcast on location. 1936 also marked another key moment in live broadcasting, as the BBC television service was also launched at the Alexandra Palace in London on the 2nd of November. It was Adele Dixon performing with the BBC Television Orchestra. BBC Director General John Reith did not like the new medium, and later in life said he never even watched television. However, he was in a minority, as television became the dominant medium of the 20th century. Now, as much as I love discussing history, it's finally time to move on to some of the key moments of a broadcast on television. The coronation of King George and Queen Elizabeth, which took place on the 9th of May in 1937, was a big event of the early television service, and the first true outside broadcast using a mobile control van. Around 10,000 viewers tuned in for this, not including household gatherings and shop windowers onlooking. The jump from 400 views for the Adele Dixon broadcast on the 2nd November just the year prior to 10,000 roughly for the coronation just goes to show how rapidly television was growing in popularity amongst viewers. In 1939, whilst television was gaining popularity and radio was flourishing, as I mentioned earlier, it made sense to announce through the medium of radio that Britain was going to be at war with Germany. So on the 1st of September 1939, with war looking unavoidable, the BBC took steps to prepare for the conflict. Shortly after noon, the television service was unceremoniously shut down following the cartoon Mickey Gala's premiere. It was said that the strong signal from the transmitter at Alexandra Palace would provide navigational aid for enemy aircraft. At the same time, the radio service was reorganised, with the national and regional services brought into one home service. Whilst television remained silent during the war, BBC Radio provided a welcome distraction, and over half the adult population of the UK would stop and listen to the Prime Minister's wartime speeches on the radio. Now, Churchill was not a fan of radio, but could see its value in allowing him to communicate directly with the British population. He made 33 such radio speeches during the war. Some were delivered in the House of Commons, whilst others were specially written. His memorable radio broadcasts are viewed as the benchmark for prime ministerial broadcasting. By this point, only 20,000 households television sets, and as television programmes were expensive to produce, it felt the resources saved could be better used elsewhere during the wartime. The post-war television audience was almost non-existent, and although the service was a monopoly, the BBC had to work hard to convince sceptics it could offer an alternative to radio, which had proved so successful during the war.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Do you remember me, Jasmine Blythe? Well, here we are after nearly 7 years, ready to start again.
So once the war ended, swiftly getting back into community and sporting events on television, 1948 marked the year that the London Olympics were broadcast live for the first time. Although the BBC had bought the rights to cover the London 1948 Olympics for just £1,000, and the 100,000 households that owned television sets were able to watch almost 70 hours of live coverage, making London the only place the Olympics were broadcast. Now notice these numbers of television sets growing rather rapidly. And despite the fears, television certainly did create a huge rise of interest, with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II broadcast live on the 2nd of June 1953 was an event that did more than any other to make television a mainstream medium. More than 20 million people watched the service on television, outnumbering the radio audience for the first time. The BBC knew the event would be popular, based on the reaction to the limited broadcast of George V's coronation concession, but could not foresee that it would mark the coming age of television, as well as the modernisation of the monarchy. This was a turning point, where it was truly evident that live broadcasting key moments like this were important to the people of Britain. So, moving on from the royals for now, and going back into the topic of sport, 1966 first introduced the FIFA World Cup to England, to a UK audience of 32.3 million people. This was probably the biggest event in British sporting history and was broadcast live on the 30th of July. The BBC and ITV combined resources to ensure the whole competition was covered in detail, and the final attracted the largest ever British television audience, as those 32.3 million viewers watched England beat West Germany 4-2. Here it began to show how much anticipation broadcasting live builds up, giving so many more people accessibility to these events as they happen live. You can watch with friends and family simultaneously, and also celebrate at the same time too. Touching upon some United States events as we evolve into accessing television globally, July 20th, 1969 at 17 minutes past 9 UK time was the precise moment when Neil Armstrong became the first man to step on the lunar surface, and also was one of the most significant events of the 20th century. Certainly it proved to be a great leap forward in covering live events for the BBC, as a mammoth 27 hours of coverage over 10 days had the UK gripped. An estimated 650 million people worldwide were glued to a television set watching Neil Armstrong take humanity's first steps on another celestial body. Of those 650 million, an estimated 16 million were, in fact, in the UK. Now we move on forward to the biggest unexpected live broadcast in history, 9/11. This was slightly different to other live broadcasts, as this incident happened truly live on air. The enduring power of the September 11 attacks is clear. An overwhelming share of Americans who are old enough to recall the day remember where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. In such a situation, we would clearly expect a dramatic shift in the ratio of fully live to recorded material, and indeed, until a little after 9:02 AM, for some 9 to 12 minutes, depending on the time at which each broadcaster turned its schedules over to catastrophe coverage as the material was fully live. During the core 9 minutes between 8:53 and 9:02, a surfing viewer would have encountered something remarkably similar on each channel. Raw footage of the burning building, accompanied by real-time voices locations in New York where they could see or had seen the impact of the plane. UK news channels also covered this topic. Although it's not a positive report of this dreadful event, this reflects the tragic impact on watching this live had on viewers, simply remembering where they were, for example, like when Britain was going to war with Germany, announced through radio. So moving on to a cheerier and incredibly popular live broadcast, this is Live Aid. This was broadcast to 150 countries. Transatlantic charity concert Live Aid was viewed by over 1.9 billion people. This TV moment had the biggest television audience to date, and it's unlikely to ever even lose its title. The spectacular, which was broadcast live by the BBC in its entirety, captured an audience of 75,000 people, as they were in the audience at London's Wembley Stadium, whilst 100,000 attended Philadelphia's John F. Kennedy Stadium. Also key to add, this was broadcast not only on BBC One, but BBC Radio 1, making it the first simultaneous broadcast of its kind. Now diving into the world of live streaming and online broadcast in 1994, we move on to the internet. Though the BBC joined the online fray in 1994 with the launch of the BBC Networking Club, the official website didn't launch until 1997. On Christmas Day on 1997, the Queen's Christmas speech was shown live online for the first time. Online content for sport, weather and children quickly followed, transforming a generation's use of media. The web allowed us to access programmes in ways we'd never experienced before. Programme, interest and channel-specific websites were launched, offering audiences an opportunity to get involved, to find out more or even become part of the broadcasts. Message boards, webcams and email all changed the way we interacted with our favourite programmes. Skipping into the modern world, a touchy subject for most of us, yet inevitably have to explore how the pandemic affected live streaming at a time when bringing communities together was crucial throughout a time we were all mostly apart. So when COVID-19 came along, all social activity restricted, people began to feel disconnected. Concerts were cancelled, churches were shut, offices were practically abandoned overnight, and many events including sports and festivals were postponed. This forced people to look for new ways of connecting, so they moved to live streaming in their droves. You may have seen how successful some of the weekly pub quiz style streams have been, or may also have seen some of your favourite bands putting on live shows from their home studios and streaming out to social media pages. Now live streaming serves to connect people, to give viewers the feeling that what they are seeing is happening right there in the moment and they are witnessing it firsthand. The effects from this, I think, are leading up are ongoing, and not so much in a negative way, yet a lot of people are still continuously being brought together by live streaming or by watching lots of content at the same time, otherwise known as multi-screening. Alongside live events happening, for example the Football World Cup that has just taken place now is a prime example of hyperconnectivity, with constant reminders on our phones going off as these live events take place, an example being the football score updates or maybe commentary on the players. By doing this and having mobile updates as well as live TV, it makes the viewers feel more connected to the game and you can't miss a trick. Multi-screening may seem a tad excessive, yet it's very useful if there's a clash of timetable. With streaming being accessible on multiple platforms in this day and age, you can still watch the footy on telly whilst your sibling watches another game on their phone, saving the battle for the TV controller. Now, linking to the hyperconnectivity, I find when a live event I enjoy is happening, it will dominate all of my social media apps. Glastonbury, for instance, has Instagram reels of performances and artists posting coverage. Facebook always has articles ongoing, potentially people at the event on Snapchat. This gives us a sense of FOMO. With so much live coverage, it lessens the FOMO slightly, as you can get a sense for what you could be seeing. Yet without the live broadcasts and only watching highlights of performances after the event have taken place, I find it's not as exciting as being in the moment. On the contrast, having so much coverage could also increase the FOMO, as it gives such good insight into what it may feel like to be at the event that it can make you want to attend the event more, making this good for businesses, going hand in hand with the statement that live events creates more excitement than on demand. You can also feel just as inclusive with radio, being able to text in to request songs or shout-outs, and they also majorly cover key live events, and you'll find this a lot during festival season. Another huge example in Cardiff particularly is the ever-loved Six Nations Rugby. With this coming up next month, the streets of Cardiff will be buzzing with excited fans, all dressed up in their Wales tops to gather down the local Wetherspoons. I talk from experience here, as last year, same as every year, was packed, yet this created a happy community feel amongst us all sitting and standing in front of the huge screens with the games being projected for us all to see. The community viewing would not be possible without the projection of the games in public areas. So this brings us to, what is the future of live broadcast? Well, the decline in traditional broadcast TV viewing is gathering pace in the UK, as the average amount of time spent watching television on a TV set, be that live broadcast, catch-up, on-demand or recorded programmes, has fallen to below 3 hours a day. That's 20% lower than in 2020 and 5% lower than in 2019, showing that the increase in TV viewing during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns was short-lived. TV viewing dropped amongst all age groups, but particularly amongst the young. Broadcast TV viewing fell 23% year on year among 16 to 24-year-olds. Compared to 2011, that age group now watches 1 hour 52 minutes less television each day, a fall of 68%. In short, traditional broadcast television is practically dead to the young, with only reality shows such as Love Island and the news and current affair programmes propping up that demographic's TV viewing figures. So, in conclusion, having seen television die down once before after the war and still make a huge return, I have no fear that it will come back. Although maybe this time, alternatively, primarily online, this isn't necessarily an awful thing. Live broadcasting is still bringing people together. Over 100 years on, through live streaming on various platforms, giving it accessibility to older family members who prefer to stick to traditional TV sets, young audiences streaming online out of convenience, being able to watch the same programmes as family members or friends who may be far away, the live element gives us a chance to remain connected. Now, television isn't necessarily fading away. For instance, the Queen's funeral that took place in September 2022 gathered around 28 million viewers, again making it one of the country's biggest ever TV events. More than 50 UK channels broadcast this service as the nation paused to pay a final farewell to Queen Elizabeth II. The BBC says that 32.5 million viewers watched at least 3 minutes of its coverage. The overnight figures from the ratings body does not include all viewers watching through streaming apps like BBC iPlayer and ITV Player, or those who saw it on big screens outdoors or in cinemas, churches or pubs. Although this is just one primary example based off of one recent royal event, coming up later this year we have King Charles's coronation, which is expected to gather a large viewing. See what I mean about history repeating? Very similar expectations to the era of King George Elizabeth's coronation. With so much accessibility to online streaming, ITV, now rebranded as ITVX, and BBC, for example, now stream at simultaneous timers on television, not only on a laptop or computer, yet also on mobiles. It gives less reasoning to watch television itself. So, although television is in danger, live broadcast is not.
And that's all, folks.